Hello everyone, my name is Deen and I'd like to welcome you to the Kubernetes for Developer video series here at Nirmata. Now this video series is intended for developers or other software professionals who are hoping to become more familiar with Kubernetes, the container orchestration platform, as well as learn how to deploy applications on Kubernetes using the Nirmata platform. Now, this video series is actually intended to be watched along with our Kubernetes for Developers blog series as well. And so the way that works is that you can read about the different Kubernetes concepts on the blog posts and then watch these videos right after to see those concepts actually being put into practice through Nirmata. However, if you are already familiar with a lot of these Kubernetes concepts, such as pods, deployments, services, feel free to just start watching along in the video. We'll provide a brief overview of what some of these concepts are, but we'll quickly get started with actually deploying an application on Kubernetes through Nirmata. I'm really excited to have you along, and let's get started. So the first concept that we'll be discussing, and really that is the theme of this specific video, is the idea of Kubernetes pods. Now, many people consider Kubernetes pods to be the basic building block of Kubernetes. Or in other words, they are the smallest unit of computing that can be scheduled or scaled by Kubernetes. Um, so essentially what they are is a layer of encapsulation for a single container or a set of containers that are traditionally co-located together from an application perspective. So for example, suppose we have a Spring Boot application that is containerized and is serving up some kind of web application to our users. And we choose to have an Nginx container proxy this web server for our users. Now, if we wanted to scale up this model which we are using, we can actually run both of these containers inside a Kubernetes pod and scale the Kubernetes pod. So for example, in this diagram, we've scaled the Kubernetes pod up to 3 instances. So we have 3 instances of the Spring Boot and Nginx containers working in the model we described earlier. So it's important to realize that in Kubernetes, it's not really containers that are being scheduled and scaled, it's pods. And Kubernetes pods also offer us additional benefits beyond just co-locating 2 containers that are typically co-located together from application perspective. One of those benefits is that containers on a Kubernetes pod actually share the same network stack, and that one implication of that is that 2 containers in a pod can communicate with each other via RPC communication as if they were both running on localhost. And why that's so powerful is that localhost is traditionally the mechanism that developers might use when developing 2 separate applications locally and trying to make sure that they can talk to one another. So Kubernetes actually makes it very easy for developers who are developing locally to then transition the way they design their applications into the Kubernetes pod, in which those 2 containers will be co-located together. Then developers can work on integrating their Kubernetes pod into the Kubernetes cluster through other resources that we will talk about in future videos and blog posts. So you can see here that we've designed a sample Spring application that we're going to deploy on Kubernetes with Nirmata. So it's a very simple application. Basically, it has one endpoint that's going to return some text. And we've already Dockerized this application and built the Docker image on our local machine using the Docker daemon. And what we're going to do now is use Docker run and specify the port mapping along with the name of our container image to then run our application locally. So we're just going to wait for Spring to get started here. Also understand that this is a very basic application, and it is very easy to deploy more complex applications on Nirmata as well. If you're interested in microservices with Spring, we actually have an entire blog post on that, and you can go to our blog to see and check that out. So we're just going to wait a little bit longer and then transition to our web browser and go to the URL and see that our application has worked successfully. Okay, So now we've navigated to our Nirmata dashboard in the catalog, and what we're going to do is create an application and call it My Spring Application. Now this application is actually going to make use of Kubernetes pods underneath, and we're going to explore how the Nirmata UI actually lets us access the pods that are being created pretty easily. So what we're going to do now is create a service. Now a service is essentially a layer of abstraction for a group of pods, allowing us to load balance it, in other words. We're going to talk more about what services are later, but what we're doing right for now is actually providing the container URL from our Harbor registry, as well as specifying the container port that our container exposes. So we'll actually discuss what services are in later blog posts, as well as a future video. So stay tuned for that, and don't worry if you don't understand what they are exactly right now. What I'm going to do quickly right now is actually change my service type to a node port. Again, don't worry about what that is, but essentially it's going to give me a way to access my service outside the scope of my cluster. Now we can actually see here how the Nirmata UI allows us to edit the pod. We can add another container. It already has the Spring application container, but we can add another one, again, falling in line with that multi-container per pod model. We can also edit how that service manages the pod, including the restart policy and the grace period, as well as some other features as well. And we can add environment variables or add volumes to our pod, which will be discussed further in later videos as well. And I'd like to briefly draw your attention to the deployment section, and deployments are actually going to be the topic in the next video. So they're very important, and stay tuned for that video as well. So now we're going to go back to our catalog, and we're actually going to run this application in an environment that already exists, and we're going to call that Spring App. So now we're going to run that application in our environment, and it's going to take a little while, but we'll be able to see that our application is now running with one pod. So we actually go into this tab and look at the different tasks which are run, the different system tasks which are run, and this gives us ability to easily debug the process of the creation of Kubernetes resources. So once again, Nirmata makes this whole process very easy for us and allows us to debug different problems. So here you can actually see me going to the URL for our service, and you can see that our application is up and running. So that whole process was pretty easy, and you can see that Nirmata lets us access the key components of Kubernetes in a very Kubernetes approach. However, it equally abstracts away a lot of the complexity of Kubernetes and lets us deploy our applications in a Kubernetes cluster quite quickly. So that concludes our video. We really hope that you enjoyed it and were able to increase your amount of knowledge on what Kubernetes pods were and how they are used to deploy an application inside of a Kubernetes cluster. Again, the purpose of this video was to shed some light for developers and people who are new to Kubernetes on what some of these key Kubernetes concepts are and how they can deploy their applications on Kubernetes through Nirmata. And we really hope and believe that this process is aided by the simplicity and the functionality of the Nirmata interface when it comes to deploying applications on Kubernetes. Thank you.